nonviolent civil disobedience. These are all ways that African Americans use to fight against inequality and segregation. But in fact, there were many more ways that they used. Whether it was in the shadows or daylight, many used their talents to express their desires. These people, who fought their own way, ultimately led to the end of racism, discrimination, and inequality. It's the late 1910s when Major League Baseball unofficially banned African American baseball players from participating. This led to a lot of anger among the African American community, but it also led to some bright minds to come up with something that would change the views of white people forever: the Negro Leagues. The proceeding were baseball leagues that presented African Americans with their only opportunity to play professional baseball. Indubitably, the Negro Leagues didn't come without their challenges. There were often financial problems, and many teams wouldn't have a field to play on. Looking to change this, one man named Rube Foster created the Negro National League, the longest lasting of the Negro Leagues. Rube was the president of the NNL, but he also managed many of the teams, most notably Chicago American Giants, of which thrived under his management. Throughout his presidency, he led the NNL to be extremely successful among the African American community, in turn giving the players a raise in salary, elongating the amount of time the NNL could exist. Unfortunately, he died in 1931 and was never able to see the road he helped pave towards the innovation of African American players and sports. 1 year after his death in 1932, the NNL collapsed. Luckily, 1 year later, it was revived by Gus Greenlee, who was able to keep it alive throughout World War II, where its popularity peaked as all races of Americans needed comfort in the tough times. During those tough times of the war, people began to realize it was time for a change. Watching the Negro Leagues, Branch Rickey, a white Major League Baseball manager and president, had been planning an attempt to integrate baseball and was looking for the right candidate. Mr. Rickey found these attributes in one of Kansas City Monarchs infielders, Jackie Robinson. Although signing Robinson was a very controversial move at the time, Branch Rickey knew that if he ever wanted to end segregation and racism, it needed to be done. Robinson was then signed on a Major League Baseball team, the Dodgers. He had to endure many things while on the team. Some Dodger teammates openly protested against having to play with an African American, while players on opposing teams deliberately pitched balls at Robinson's head and spiked him with their cleats in deliberately rough slides into bases. But even through all these hardships, with the encouragement of his family, friends, and Branch Rickey, he was able to tolerate these actions for the greater cause of ending racism and inequality. As Robinson's baseball career continued, other managers began to sign promising African American players, and soon the racism began to die down in games. Although there was still segregation and inequality, many came to the realization that African American players were just as good, some of them much better, than the white players in the MLB. Many even came to respect these players, and thus slowly but surely paved the way for an end of segregation, inequality, and racism. Music. African Americans express their desires through jazz, a style of music created for this exact reason. The story of jazz begins in the 17th century when the African people were taken from their homes and brought to North America. During their work, often in the fields, they would sing work chants and songs as a way to pass the time and cry out against their oppressors.
Cotton, sugar, indigo, iron, coal, peanuts, steel, railroad, you name it. The foundation of the United States rests on the sweat of my people.
What you just heard was not an actual work chant used by slaves, as there are very few recorded, but instead a more modern take as a beginning to a famous African-American jazz pianist Duke Ellington's song and performance, My People.
The blues don't know nobody as a friend, ain't been nowhere.
Jazz then became a very large part of African American culture in the 1920s, people using it for the same reason they would use work chants. The tone, lyrics, mood, and feel of jazz pieces express emotions. Whether it's the blues communicating sadness and desire, or ragtime with its upbeat mood telling of thankfulness, all jazz songs and musicians tell a story. There were many African American musicians who used jazz as a way to express their desires of equality. As you've seen, Duke Ellington was one of these, but there were many more, most notably being Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie, and many more. These musicians used their musical talents to form big bands and combos, and most importantly, they used their skills to compose pieces that helped them fight against inequality. Then, when times became tough as World War II raged on, a white clarinetist, Benny Goodman, searched for bandmates who could bring joy to audiences. He found the traits he was looking for in white drum set player Gene Krupa and black pianist Teddy Wilson, thus creating the first interracial jazz ensemble. Goodman had created this ensemble for the recording studio only, as most places didn't allow interracial musical entertainment. Of course, this was angering to a lot of folk. As Louis Armstrong once put it, "I remember when it wasn't no crime for cats of any color to get together and blow." End quote. But soon the band members realized that they were just too good to be refined in a recording studio. Although it was hard to find places to perform, eventually, after people realized the sheer talent of the three, restaurants, jazz rooms, and other performance places lifted their bands on interracial performances, all because of this trio's sheer talents and musical abilities. As Benny Goodman put it, "The three of us worked together as if we had been born to play this way." End quote. All these things, black jazz greats, the ability to channel expression, and the allowment of interracial ensembles all led to one thing. People began to no longer see the skin colors of the players, but rather the color that each of them added to the music, that is jazz, and in turn added color to life in a time of sadness and depression. Lastly, African Americans were able to use their skills in food and cooking to combat racism and inequality. Our story begins once again in the 17th century. During this time, slaves were often only given rations, but even using these little resources that they were provided with, slaves integrated African culture into European dishes, thus creating soul food. This way of cooking, soul food, includes many of your favorite foods: cornbread, hush puppies, jambalaya, gumbo, fried chicken, and even mac and cheese. In fact, macaroni and cheese was created by one of Thomas Jefferson's 600 slaves, James Hemings. In fact, Hemings was also said to have created foods such as ice cream, french fries, and whipped cream. James Hemings was born in 1765 into slavery, and at age 9 was given as a gift to the slave owner's daughter, Martha Jefferson, who had recently married Thomas Jefferson. At one point, when Thomas Jefferson was sent to France as ambassador, he brought a few of his slaves with him, one being Hemings. Here is where Hemings learned the art of French cooking. Then, when Jefferson came back to the States, he made Hemings his cook, where Hemings created those foods we have discussed before. After the 13th Amendment was approved, soul food still lived on as a way for African Americans to express themselves. One way that people were able to use this skill was creating soul food restaurants that featured their culture of cooking. An important example of this was when Lacey Carl Wilson Sr. and his wife Bertha Wilson created the Florida Avenue Grill. The Florida Avenue Grill was established in 1944 as one of the first restaurants that would feature soul food and one of the first restaurants established by an African American. Indubitably, as with everything in this time, creating a successful restaurant did not come without struggles, especially with racial comments and discrimination. Eventually, as the war raged on, people from the African American community began looking for comfort, and they found this in soul food. This led to a huge incline in sales. Seeing this, many whites decided to give it a try. They loved it, and throughout the war, it became the favorite restaurant of many people of all races. They all enjoyed good food in a time of sadness and depression, and began to realize that food is food, and it doesn't matter who makes it. Those are but 3 examples of how African Americans were able to use their talents to fight against racism and inequality. Although it may not seem like it, these 3 are connected on so many different levels other than this. First, they all gained popularity and thrived during World War II. Second, they all helped abundantly clear the path to equality and the civil rights movement, as well as lowered the amount of racism in America. These brave people, who use their talents to help them speak up in a world of hatred and segregation, are the reason why America is as great as it is today. They are the reason America is the land of the free. They are the reason. They are the reason America is the home of the brave.